name is Brittany Stump, and I am the volunteer coordinator here for the Foster Grandparent Program of Northern Utah at Weber Human Services. This is the fifth and final tutorial that you'll need to go over before you enter the schools as one of our new tutors. This one is all about reading comprehension, and we'll go over a couple of scenarios that you might encounter while you're working with your students. So, we've already gone over the first 4 of the 5 key skills for literacy development for children ages kindergarten through 3rd grade. We've done phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and this one is on comprehension. Okay, so we're going to go over a possible scenario. Let's say that one of your students' name is Emily. Emily's teacher tells her foster grandparent tutor, whom we'll call Joyce in this scenario, that Emily has trouble understanding what she reads. So, during the initial tutoring assessment, Joyce shows Emily a class book. She picks Poppleton Every Day by Cynthia Rylant. Emily says, "Oh, I know these books. I have read some of them, but not this one." Joyce says, "Do you want me to read it to you, or do you want to read it?" And Emily says, "I'll read it." Joyce says, "Is there anything that you do before you start to read a book?" And Emily shrugs. So, during the initial tutoring session assessment, Joyce tells Emily it helps readers to look at the cover and the title and guess what the book might be about. That's called making a prediction. Emily says, "It looks like Poppleton and a friend are going sailing." And Joyce asks, "Have you ever been sailing?" Emily says, "No, but I have seen sailboats on TV. Once I saw someone tip over." Joyce tells her, "Let's see if that happens to Poppleton." After Emily reads Poppleton Every Day easily, Joyce asks Emily a few questions about the story. Joyce says, "Let's think about how Poppleton felt about sailing." Emily says, "I don't think that he liked falling in the water." Joyce says, "That was probably pretty scary. I wonder if Poppleton will want to go sailing with Fillmore again." And Emily says, "Sure, because he had fun." This reply from Emily causes Joyce to wonder if Emily has understood the end of the story, because in the story, Poppleton is very angry about their rough boat ride, yet Fillmore, his sailing buddy, is laughing about what a great trip they had. Fillmore is unaware of Poppleton's feelings, and this makes Poppleton more upset. Joyce wonders if this lack of understanding is what Emily's teacher meant when she said that Emily was having trouble with comprehension. Joyce realizes she needs to find out how much Emily did or did not understand about the story. So Joyce wonders if she should A, ask a more open-ended question about the story so that Emily can use her own words to describe what she understood. B, move on to another story, and after finishing it, question Emily to assess her comprehension. Or C, incorporate by asking more questions that incorporate parts of the story. She will ask the questions in a conversational way to make the exchange feel more like a conversation than a test. Joyce opts for A, asking an open-ended question. Joyce decides to ask a very open-ended question to help Emily feel more success in her ability to answer questions about the story that they just read. Joyce says, "So what do you think of Poppleton?" Emily says, "He's funny." Joyce says, "Why do you think he's funny?" And Emily says, "Because he's so fat and round." Joyce realizes that Emily's responses are far more about the visual information that she's gathered from the book and not from the text. Joyce realizes she needs to ask questions that are more reflective of the storyline to help Emily make the link between the text that she's read and the events in the story. In this scenario, Joyce decides to move on to another story. Joyce introduces another story, and she and Emily begin by looking at the book cover and reading the title. Emily begins to read through the book very quickly, and Joyce stops her after the second chapter to ask questions. Emily shrugs her shoulders and keeps reading. Joyce realizes that she should not have let Emily start a new story without first talking about and gaining understanding of the first story. By moving on to a new story, Joyce realizes that she's confirmed Emily's belief that she is reading well and that comprehension is secondary to getting through the text. So in C, ask questions incorporating the text, Joyce asks indirect open-ended questions such as, I wonder why Fillmore was laughing so much. Do you remember what made him laugh? After each question, she tries to make an association between the story and an experience that Emily might have had. For example, she asks, have you ever been in a situation where your friends thought something was funny, but you didn't? How did it make you feel? Asking questions like these helps Joyce see that Emily did not comprehend the text. Even though she was able to read the words, she was able to decode the text, she was not actually absorbing their meaning. And I personally have encountered students like these before. So, assessment, what just happened? Joyce gained a better understanding of what Emily's teacher means when she describes her trouble understanding what she reads. Joyce observed that Emily doesn't independently use the cover picture or the title of the book to make predictions about the story. Emily isn't able to make connections between this and other Poppleton stories that she's read. And Emily doesn't use the text and pictures to draw conclusions about the meaning of the story. So she's not making associations. So what are the things that we're looking for that good readers do, readers that are comprehending the text? They should be able to do at least 4 of these things. They should be able to identify story elements, so the student can describe specific details like characters, setting, feelings, emotions, etc. They should be able to concentrate on the text. A student is able to stay on task without getting distracted, and this one can be really tough. They need to be able to describe things in a sequence of events. So they should be able to start at the beginning of the story and summarize to the end. They can recall important details in order with a clear beginning, middle, and end. And then 4, they summarize. The student can integrate the central ideas in a meaningful way. And the school that I was working in, I would always ask my students to give me 5 points of a good retell. So they would need to know what the title is. They would need to give me at least 3 details in sequential order about the story that they just read. And then 5, they would need to summarize the whole thing and kind of tell me like what overall is this story about. So story elements. How do we help our students define story elements in a text? So let's read this text. Let's make a rock band, said Beth. Great, said Rob. I can play the drums. He hit the drums. Rat-a-tat-tat. Kim smiled. I will play the guitar. Strum, strum, strum. Jim picked up a keyboard and pushed the keys. Cool, I will play this. Ting, ting, tong. Bill started to sing la, la, la. Beth looked around. What should I play? She dug in a box and pulled out a big bell. Look, a cowbell. Bang, bang, bong. Let's rock. They played and sang all night long. Okay, so this is a silly little text, but if I were going to have my students read that, one of my first questions to understand the text might be, who is the main character of this? Well, in this case, there are 2. It would have been Kim and Rob. What happens to the characters in this text? Well, they play music together. That sort of thing. You might also want to incorporate the images in a text if images are available, and ask the children to make predictions about what they think is going on. You might ask them to create their own story by looking at a picture. So for this one, you might ask them to look at the picture and create a story based on it, and tell them, hey, you can be as creative as you want. So perhaps the student looks at this image and says, once upon a time, there were 2 friends who wanted to travel to faraway lands. So with imagination and creativity, they developed a teleporter in their room and disguised it as a cardboard box. They then traveled to many fabulous places and had many great adventures. So that is a good story based on this image. Okay, now if we were going to analyze the story, what is the title? It was Once Upon a Time. What is the setting? The setting is a room of two friends. Characters, two friends who have good imaginations. So not only are we naming the characters, but we're also describing them using adjectives. What is their problem? What is the conflict? They want to visit faraway lands. Did they come up with a solution? Yes, they did. They invented a teleporter disguised as a cardboard box. What is the theme of this story? How would I summarize it? Imagination is fun. Those are the kinds of things that you would like your students to do. So rather than just being like, well, it was about a box, we're looking for specific details here. That lets us know that they are comprehending the text. Okay, concentration. This one's really hard, especially if you are in a situation where you're tutoring kids out in like a common space. Hopefully you have an area in your workstation where that is just used for tutoring. But at the school that I used to tutor at, it was just out in the hallway in a table, and kids would be walking by constantly, other kids going to the bathroom or coming in from recess. It's really hard to comprehend the texts that you're reading if your attention is off task all the time. So you want to try to remove as many distractions as possible. So one of the best ways to do that is to not be in a common area, to have a designated place where tutoring is happening. If your workstation has that space available, if not, you want to just try to redirect their attention to the text. So here are some ways that you can improve concentration. You can include some physical activity. So a lot of times if I notice that my students were really fidgety when I first got them, I might stop what we're doing and say, okay, it's time to get wiggles out. And so we're going to stand up and shake around and maybe do a few deep breaths and do the wiggles. They really like that. And then sit back down. Because sometimes when kids are really fidgety, especially if they've been sitting for long periods during the day, their concentration is hard to get on task. You might have attention signals. So if you're in a common space and the kids are getting distracted, maybe their buddy has just walked by to use the restroom or something, you might use an attention signal like 1, 2, 3, eyes on me, just to get them back and be like, hey, this is what we're doing right now. You can talk to so-and-so later. Right now we are reading this text, and get them back on task. You want to try to remove visual distractions. And again, if you're in a common area, that might be difficult. But if you do have your own designated area for tutoring, you want to try to remove as many distractions as possible. Try to eliminate any kind of digital devices because these kids get really distracted by those things. You can play memory games. You can break tasks into smaller pieces. So if you have a student who is really having a hard time concentrating on a full page of text, let's say we're reading something like this, then rather than focusing on the entire page, I might say, okay, let's get through this first paragraph. We'll take a break, have a couple deep breaths. Maybe we'll stand up and get the wiggles out again, and then come back and do the remaining paragraph. So that's another way. And you can include some mindfulness. Don't be afraid to be like, you know what? It seems like you're agitated right now. Why don't we close our eyes and take a few deep breaths together until we get calmed down? And then when it seems like they're quiet and they're ready to focus, you can bring them back on task. There's a really great link here to Edutopia. These are some other ways to get kids on task. So 7 ways to increase a student's attention span include that physical activity. No, we do not want to sign up. Have those attention breaks. Adjust time frames. So for example, if you have like a 6-year-old, you want to try to spend less time with them than you might with like an 8-year-old, because their attention span is just not there. So if you're working with a kindergartner, you might expect 12 minutes of their attention. But if you're working with a third grader, you can expect more like 30 minutes. That's important. We already talked about removing visual distractions and playing memory games, and breaking the tasks into smaller pieces. So yeah, we went over most of that. There's just a couple other things there that I found useful if you want to check that out. Okay, so next. Someone that's comprehending the text should be able to give you sequential events. So you're going to ask your student to follow, not always, but you might ask them the following questions about the story. And you could ask them to write these down if they're working on penmanship, or you could just ask them to tell you the answers. So what happened first in the story? What problem does this character or characters face? What is the conflict? Do they have helpers? And what is your conclusion about the story? So they need to be able to identify at least those 4 things, if not 5, in sequential order. And then they should be able to summarize. So you're going to ask your students to give you a summary of the events of the story, and then ask them what their conclusion is. Here are some other things too that I like to do to get kids interested in stories if they're struggling with comprehension, because if their attention is not there for lack of interest, sometimes it helps to get an idea of what it is that they're interested in, so that when you are picking the materials that you're going to go over, you can get them more focused by zeroing in on something that they're interested in. So you might put before them something like this. What is your favorite type of book? In science, in animals, in fantasy, in nonfiction. And if they have no idea what those things are, then that's a good opportunity to explain. I had kiddos that I tutored that loved science because they like to learn about space and planets. There were lots of kids, especially little girls, that loved animals. So anything about a dog, a cat, or zoo animals, or exotic creatures would be good for them. A lot of kids like dragons and wizards in the fantasy category. There's that Wings of Fire series right now that is really, really popular. And then for nonfiction, I remember a lot of my students really liked real life stories about people like Elon Musk, but I also had students who were really into sports. And so getting biographies was a really good way to get them interested and to help them focus their attention. So when we're working on comprehension, if it's something that a student really, really struggles with in the beginning, you might want to get those stories that they're interested in because that's something that they like to do. And then after their comprehension builds based on that, because you've targeted their interest, then you can expand. Another exercise, you might ask them to write or tell you a story. So you might ask your students to create a story including the following words: dog, cat, grass, river, fish, boy, and tree. So then they're going to have to think about all of those different things and then piece them together into a story. So an example is: a boy was walking on the street when suddenly a dog and a cat appeared out of thin air and told him, "Go to the river and talk to the flying fish." Surprised by this message and the fact that a dog and a cat were able to speak, he ran to the river and, unable to see the flying fish, he climbed a tree to have a better view. He could see a lot of green grass next to the water, and finally he saw a fish. He shouted, "I'm here, flying fish." Just when the fish was about to start speaking, the boy heard, "Wake up! We're in the middle of math class. It was just a dream, but what a dream." So this is incorporating all of the elements of the story, but then you're igniting their imagination, and try to use humor to encourage them. When kids can make something funny, they get really into what they're doing. You might show them images and ask them to describe these images as if they were characters in a book. So for this first one, we've got Owl the alligator. Al enjoyed sitting in the sunshine and waiting for unexpected tourists. This one is a sloth, so the kid names it Sal the Sloth. Sal the Sloth likes to take naps and daydream about beaches. And then this one, we have a chameleon. The student names him Kip. Kip the chameleon loves hot air ballooning and eating grasshoppers. So incorporating elements of the image into describing a character. So those are just like a handful of things that you can do to help students with comprehension. Most students will struggle with comprehension if they have a difficult time reading, but the scenario that we used at the beginning of this tutorial, perhaps a student is a really good reader, but they're having a hard time retaining anything that they're reading. So you might want to slow those individuals down, work on details, and then when kids are, their reading level is up to snuff, that's when you really want to target the comprehension. And again, the most important takeaway that everyone has to remember anytime you're working with small children is that even a small amount of progress is progress. Our students will struggle in the beginning, but tiny steps in the right direction are a major achievement. I add this to all of our slides because it's important to keep in mind. And thank you for your time. Here's all of our contact information. If you have any questions, please feel free to call me or email me. And then this is all of the information for Charity. She's our director. Our mailing address, my office is 311, but if you're mailing, it is the 320. And I hope you have a good day. Thank you.